Greetings, brethren, and welcome again to Shepherd's Voice Magazine. Thank you for tuning in. We're so glad that you could take the time to join us. I want to start off today's episode by making a small clarification with regard to the message that I gave last week entitled Advertising Figs. Old Pastor Redshirt there last week blundered a bit and said that the tree with no figs that was cursed by Jesus Christ was a particular type of fig tree whose absent fruit made it identifiable and so on. When in reality, all fig trees, the ones that bear fruit at least, have a growth cycle of first fruit and then leaves. And what the absent fruit that made it identifiable, and that was because it was out of season, to the and along with the other trees that were obviously at a different point in their growth cycle. And of course, it was said that it was not the season for figs. So it was the fact that it was out of season. And it's my bad, and it's an example of what happens when you try to go from memory sometimes, and maybe don't do as much of the legwork as I should be responsible for doing. So I apologize for that. And the point, though, however, remains the same, is that the fig tree in question was indeed falsely advertising that it had figs, or creating the expectation of these figs. And as we concluded last week, we landed on what Jesus had to say when Peter pointed out the withered tree. Christ said, "Have faith in God." And that's where we're going to pick up today, with an eye on the enormity, setting aside, the sufficiency of this faith that we have been given. It is absolutely enormous, and I think that there is sometimes some unseen power that maybe we just don't see initially or respond to initially. So it's hopefully through messages like these that we can maybe grasp some of the many facets and layers that are involved with Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, as we've looked at in recent weeks. And it's in that having that kind of a mindset and that sort of train of thought that today we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to look at an aspect of faith that maybe we haven't considered. And we might call it faith's unseen ability, if you wanted a title for today's message. And the prayer would be here at the outset, brethren, to have or to receive the wisdom and ability to come with a changed heart first when we make our appeal in faith. We have to come with a change in perspective. And we want to have a look today at the effects, if you will, that one's faith can have with regard to another. And these sorts of instances come in all shapes and sizes, to be sure. And the examples that we're going to look at briefly today, folks, happen to have healing and relief as a result, for sure. And they're carried out differently than other examples that we might read of where Jesus had the willingness to heal. He did go out and he healed the lepers, for example, and other instances where he healed. But in these instances we're going to look at today, these were people that came petitioning on behalf of somebody else, and we're going to see how the effects of that came about, and what it was, and what motivated Jesus Christ to act as he did. We often speak of the effects of faith as it pertains to our own perspective and what it does to us inwardly in our relationship with our Savior. And that's a great topic too, but it's not what we're going to talk about as much today, and as narrowly as that at least. Today we're going to attempt to keep things short. I'll see if that actually becomes a reality. But we're going to try to narrow the focus just a touch. So let's look at some instances wherein Jesus Christ healed individuals who were not present, or that Jesus Christ wasn't physically present with. In these instances, suffering elsewhere while a loved one, or as we'll see, an employer, a boss, interacted with Christ on their behalf. As we know, there are, as we said, many places in the Bible and in the Gospels where Jesus healed folks. But we're going to look at these three. And these are scriptures of review. We've all read these before, and I'll try not to dwell too long in the weeds in some of the concepts that are in here. But I want us to really take notice of what the effects of our faith can be on another individual, and the reasons why that kind of gets the attention of Jesus Christ, as it did to these folks that we're going to read about today. Some folks came crying on their own, looking for help. And as we're going to see, these folks, these others, were brought by someone else. They were brought by someone else. Like the father with the possessed boy we read of a few weeks back, before he was brought before Jesus with a request of being healed. In kind of contrast to what happened in that account, the three gospel accounts we're going to review today, we're going to find that it was through the words alone of Jesus Christ that brought about healing and relief to suffering, while, as we said, they were somewhere else. And assuming by how these scriptures are written, these people might not have even known at the moment that somebody was petitioning on their behalf. And I guess I should say at the outset that this is not one of those, if you have enough faith, you'll be healed messages. It's not that type of message. I'm not going to touch on right now why that is the case, really. What I'm hoping we can take away from today, God willing, is that through these examples, that this healing was a response, and is a response that with a reason enacted by Jesus Christ. Okay, he did, as we've noted numerous times, he didn't do anything without cause or reason. And I guess we'll also note, but we're not going to go crazy on the point that, you know, these were Gentile individuals that we're going to look at today, who came in faith of varying degrees, as we'll see, which I guess in itself points to there was a lesson being taught to the Jewish audience, especially at that time, because you see, their particular hurdle, as we've read about and can read about in the book of Romans, in terms of sin, was dependence on the law and the absence of faith. Okay? For whatever reason that God has determined it, the Gentile listener early on was far more receptive and tore themselves away from what their proclivity was as a people at the time, which seems to have kind of transcended the generations, which was idolatry. And we know that that comes again in all shapes and sizes, idolatry. So we have here is three individuals who come who were, let's just call it, non-Jews. They were not part of the Jewish audience that Jesus Christ was initially ministering to. When we look at it in those terms, to their way of viewing things, that is the Jewish audience, it might seem natural for them to resist faith. It was prophesied that great numbers of them would reject Jesus Christ outright. He would be a stumbling block to them. And to a very, very great degree, that is absolutely the case. Therefore, the examples that we're going to look at are of what in no small way amounts to Jesus Christ recognizing and, as we said, responding to faith, and in turn teaching and making an example of what the results can possibly be. Okay? And knowing that these miracles and so forth, they can only help the believer lean into belief, as it were. They can't actually fundamentally change somebody's heart, and we're going to see how that plays in here in a moment. But this message is about just this, the importance of faith, and the importance of faith to Jesus Christ in particular. And the point being is that there was always a reason, as we said, for the things that Jesus did and said, and it was all related to the completing of his Father's will. And it's through that, therefore, that the lessons that we can glean from all this are indeed intended for hearers and believers across the ages, and thank God for that. And for believers from around the world of every race and nation, as our Bibles will tell us. So, with that, let's jump to our first example, and this is the centurion's servant. We'll use the example today that is given in Matthew chapter 8, and we're going to begin in verse 5. And we're going to look at the account of a centurion who came to Jesus because his servant was at the point of death. And this is, as we said, this fellow's boss, basically, who is coming in and making this intercession on his behalf. So, beginning in verse 5 of chapter 8, Matthew, we read, "When he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, 'Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, in terrible agony.' In verse 7, he said to him, 'Am I to come and heal him?'" Now, I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible. Again, folks, your translation might be slightly different in its wording, but the essence is fundamentally the same. So we see here that Jesus comes to the house, but the centurion met him outside, as we're going to see here. And as we said, the individual here is indeed of the Gentile persuasion. He's a non-Jew, as we might surmise. And he humbly tells Jesus that he was not worthy to have Jesus come into his home. We read that in verse 8. It says, "Lord," the centurion replied, "I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed." So this saying that he wasn't worthy to have Christ come under his roof was his first act, if you will, of reverence towards Jesus Christ. You see, it connotes a particular shift in his thinking from what would have probably been common amongst his peers and likely the station that he held in the world and in life. The individual here had clearly, and in my mind anyway, dealt with or was dealing with a very real conversion. So as we said in verse 8, he says, "Lord," the centurion replied, "I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed." You'll have to forgive me, brethren. It's about 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 Celsius. And that's indoors here in Calgary as this is being recorded. And I guess we'll note that he started off, the centurion, from a point of self-awareness, and that is that, like all of us, he came to Jesus initially in an unworthy state. And we know that it is only through the cleansing blood of Jesus Christ that is the only thing that can bring us anywhere near concepts like worthiness. So we've got that to jump off with. And he started here. He started with that, which is significant. But it's also interesting to note that he truly understood the authority of Jesus Christ. See, remarkably enough, and probably unlike his peers and contemporaries, as I said, he knew that if Christ only spoke the words, that his servant could be healed. In verse 9, it says, "For I too am a man under authority, having soldiers under my command. I say to this one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it." So, without dwelling on it too long, he understood the authority of Jesus Christ. He could see there was a presence in Christ that was that of a king, and one who was in charge. And this was something that was unfortunately lost on the Jewish community, particularly during that period. And the compelling aspect of this example, as we might infer, is really how Jesus responded. It's actually kind of exciting. You see, in verse 10, it says, "Hearing this, Jesus was amazed." He was amazed. This was something that he perhaps didn't expect. And he said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great a faith." Now, that's a bit of a shot at the children of Israel, the lost sheep of Israel that he is there ministering to, because clearly there was a dearth of faith, and this guy has an abundance of it. And this is perhaps a small detail, but it isn't a kind of interesting and a hopeful thing that it is possible to amaze Jesus Christ. And to amaze him in a good way. See, that fig tree that we spoke of last week, he didn't fare so well. You know, he didn't come off so well when we compare the two narratives. And not to be overlooked, and probably the most compelling thing that Jesus said there, that it was in all of Israel that he hadn't found somebody so keyed into faith and so alive in their faith, as it were. You see, Christ's ministry was indeed to the lost sheep of Israel, as it were, and to try to bring them into the hope of the gospel. But he was met many times with outright rejection. So it's with that in mind, it would seem that this was an inspiring event, even to Jesus. As someone from a distinctly pagan society had put his faith in the correct spot. I think that's pretty amazing. And to me, it shows how much the faith of an individual means to Jesus Christ. And it doesn't matter where they're from. So we'll move on. Verse 11, he says, "I tell you that many will come from east and west to share the banquet with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." So there is a restored Israel in mind in the kingdom, for sure. "But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And we won't dwell on all these details here, but Jesus is giving us an idea as to the stark contrast that exists between having faith and not having faith. Okay, we can kind of summarize that little portion by saying that. We'll move on from there in verse 13. "Then Jesus told the centurion, go, period. As you have believed, let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that very moment." You see, Jesus, who pointed out the great faith of this man and said the word to bring about healing. He recognized this guy's faith. And he didn't even go into the house to look at the fellow. I do think it's interesting that he said, let it be done for you. Let, implying, and to my mind, confirming that these instances are things that are allowed by God in his mercy according to his will for us and what he purposes in himself. See, the servant, who we know very little about, indeed benefited from the centurion's faith. We don't know a whole lot about what kind of faith the servant had. But this was an act of faith that this centurion brought to Jesus, and he recognized it. And while the centurion's faith was already a work in progress, and clearly we could rightfully surmise that his faith was headed in the right direction, the servant's inclination to believe or possibly keep on believing, we have to believe, were at the very least enhanced. So we'll move on to the second example, which would be the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. And for this example, we'll turn to the account in Mark 7, and we'll begin in verse 24, and we'll read to about verse 30. Mark 7, verse 24, it says, he got up and he departed from there to the region of Tyre and Sidon. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape notice. And I'll just note that, news of Jesus and what he was doing and the places he was going to and traveling to and from got around. And it's remarkable because he did it without electricity, let alone social media or anything along those lines. And verse 25, it says, instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit or a demon came and fell at his feet. And the woman was a Gentile or a Greek-speaking person, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And as we've, excuse me, brother, as we've noted, Jesus' ministry as such was geared towards the Jewish audience and the children, as he refers to them here, of Israel. And this statement would be in keeping with to the Jew first and then to the Gentile, as we read in Acts 3:26 and Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, among others. But he was really making sure that it was known that he was no parlor act, and he wasn't about to put his ability on display just for the sake of doing so. Also, we need to keep in mind that many of the children of Israel did respond in faith to Jesus Christ. So it was imperative that he maintain a focus on feeding them. But again, with that in mind, he wasn't about squandering his energy and effort regarding the work that his Father sent him to do. He was, however, keenly aware of faith in people. Now, as we've noted before, we have to record these particular episodes in chunks that are about 20-25 minutes long, and we're coming up on about 23-24 minutes here. So if you'll pardon the intrusion, there's either going to be a spinning block like last time or a swipe coming across your screen anytime now. You see, while his personal ministry may have been to that Jewish audience, as we've noted, his ongoing and ministry that would carry on into the future was to go into all of the world. And of course we read that in Matthew 28:19 and 20. That's the famous go therefore into the world and make disciples of all men. So much like how we read that he was amazed by the response given by the centurion in Matthew 8, what this woman said next struck a chord with Jesus, and he was motivated to respond. So we'll continue. Verse 28, she replied to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And I've always found this to be an interesting turn of phrase and a very interesting piece of writing. It sounds a lot to me like a person who is admitting that they are actually subsisting on what was not consumed by the original intended recipient. And that's significant, I believe. And it does mean, in part, that the effects of another's faith, or in some cases even the absence of faith, can be pretty dynamic for someone who is truly looking to live by and live on faith. And this woman, in similar fashion to the centurion that we read about, also spoke of a change in her life and the position that she had in it. You see, the centurion was a man of authority who came to a place of humility. This woman, who was also coming to Jesus, was coming from a similar kind of place of self-awareness. And we'll note here that she didn't push back at Christ's reference to the dogs, of her being of dogs, or, referred to along with dogs. Rather, she accepted where she came from and understood what exactly it was that was sustaining her. Also knowing that Jesus could heal, she made her petition in faith. And in verse 29, then he told her, because of this reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. And when she went back to her home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. So because of your reply, you see, Jesus' response wasn't based on her righteousness, but rather her humility and her faith. Again, from this place of self-awareness, she had great faith and knew that even scraps or crumbs from the bread of life, as it were, that Jesus was giving to his people, that Jewish audience that we've been talking about, well, it was enough. It was sufficient to heal her daughter, and she knew that. And her faith made that kind of a difference to her daughter. But more importantly, we've always said that God has to be the benefactor in any kind of relationship or transaction that we have with him. Christ has to benefit first. So it's more important that we understand that her faith made a difference to Christ. And he was motivated to respond based on that. And again, he's making an example of the full scope and capacity and power and the unseen ability of faith. So we'll move to our third example. I don't usually do 1, 2, 3 examples like this. This is a little bit different of a message for me, but certainly it bears use in this particular message. So here we read of the official at Capernaum's son. And this was the second instance wherein Jesus healed at the request of a faithful Gentile official. Okay, this was an official, similar to the first example that we read of. But this one was a little bit different. Turn with me, if you will, to John chapter 4. We're going to read from verses 46 to 53 and go through a little bit here. Because we see that an official came to see Jesus because his son was sick and at the point of death. Much like the servant was to the centurion in the first example in Matthew 8. Verse 46, John 4. He went again to Cana of Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. Of course, it's referring back to the wedding scene where he was asked to about wine because they had run out of the wine, and he turned the water into it. There was a certain royal official whose son was ill at Capernaum. And when this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea into Galilee, he went to him and he pleaded with him to come down and heal his son, since he was about to die. And again, the times and workings of Jesus Christ's ministry were known throughout society. This official appears to have, at the very least, the belief in the miracles that he's likely heard about. And in the anguish of a parent of a suffering child, he appeals to Jesus for what he had seen, or at least heard of having been done with others, something that others had received. He believed that these things happened. And Jesus told him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And here he's telling this to a Gentile individual. But again, he's not a parlor act. And in our first example, Christ is amazed at the centurion's faith. In the second, he's kind of motivated by the Syrophoenician woman's faith. Here, however, things are a bit more direct. You see, it would seem that he responded to the centurion in part because the centurion knew who Jesus was and the authority of Jesus Christ, and in turn that power. And he came to him from this place of humility, and he knew that Christ had the power over life and death, and there was an unmistakable visible faith. And with the Syrophoenician woman, in part because of her faith in what she believed sustained her, and had the power over life and death in her life and in her child's life. Well, let's continue in verse 49 here, where it says, "Sir," the official said to him, "come down before my son dies." You see, this man is at the end. He's about to hit the wall. He's desperate. And faith would appear here to perhaps be in its infancy with him. But he thinks at the very least that if Jesus doesn't come down with him, that his son will die. He is submitting to the fact that he knows Jesus Christ can heal and has healed. He knows at the very least that Jesus is able to change a particularly sad outcome that he feels is impending. So let's turn over to verse 50. It says, "Go," Jesus told him. "Go." One word, go. "Your son will live." The man believed. And it says, literally, the words that Jesus said to him, he believed, and he departed. And while he was still going down, his servants met him on the way. They were coming back the other way, saying that his boy was alive. And he asked them what time he got better. And they said, "Yesterday," and this translation says around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or the 7th hour of the day, the fever left him. In verse 53, the father realized that this was the very hour at which Jesus had told him, "Your son will live." So he himself believed, along with his whole household. Again, the effects of one person's faith on others. This is important to Jesus Christ, as we've said. See, this fella didn't have great, tremendous faith, but he did have enough. He had just enough to come to Jesus Christ. And sometimes that's where we're at, folks. And you see, we looked at this particular example lastly because it is interesting for this different reason and perspective, because it really shows to me, at least, just how deeply important this faith is to Jesus Christ, and how this individual's lack of abundance in terms of faith was the key element to the story. You see, signs and wonders from God are indeed favorable, but they shouldn't be, and they truly cannot be, the foundation of our faith. Faith has to come from something unseen, brethren. And this is because in and of themselves, as we said at the outset, they actually can't change the heart. They are of great help and benefit to the one who might believe, or who does believe and is in the process of their faith growing and being cultivated within them. And I'd imagine that the three people who were healed without even being in personal physical contact with Jesus Christ, as we read, were more likely to be inclined to become or remain faithful. More likely than not, I would imagine. And if we're going to kind of summarize here, in each of the examples, the person being healed, one, either couldn't come to Jesus themselves. In two of the examples, the person was ill to the point of death. And in one, the individual was suffering with this possession by a demon, and she couldn't come to Jesus on her own. And it's in that vein that we realize that they didn't ask Jesus for their own healing. Their benefit and their healing, rather, was brought about through the faith of someone else, a father, a mother, even a boss that had petitioned Jesus on behalf of their loved one or their servant, who clearly was someone that was beloved to that centurion. And in each of these instances, they never physically touched or saw Jesus. And that part is amazing in itself. But in each situation, you see, Jesus only spoke to the person interceding, the person petitioning on their behalf. And still, based on the faith of that individual, the loved one was healed. As we've noted, it's interesting in that in the first two accounts, the individual pleading for the healing was put forth and used as an example by Jesus as people who had faith, visible faith. Yet that third account, the father asking for the healing of his son, well, Christ kind of reminded him how small his faith was. And I think this is important, because I think that speaks to where we can be kind of generally. Sometimes our faith can feel and maybe appear very small. And the reason why that's so important, brethren, is that Jesus was motivated to respond at the smallest demonstration, even that last grasp in faith, in love for another individual. And I don't think we need to take a big deep dive into it as to reasons why that would probably affect Jesus Christ or get him in his heart where he was motivated to respond. So, brethren, the point here today would be to never sell short the effect that our faith can have on the lives of others. There is an unseen ability in faith. And certainly God doesn't heal in every instance, and we know that. But when we put our faith out there and appeal to his will, there are no bad outcomes. There are no bad outcomes. Whether our petition is granted or denied in this life. Because in the next one, in that kingdom, then we will see the rewards of our faith. And these things will come to fruition for us. So with that, brethren, that's 9 pages today. And I'm out of them. So we want to ask you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the channel. And if you found this or any of our messages in our catalog interesting and helpful to you and your walk in faith, kindly give us the thumbs up. Give us some response at the bottom. We look forward to your comments. We thank you for joining us today. Happy Sabbath, and we'll see you next time on Shepherd's Voice Magazine.